Hello learners, I am Dr. Sunita Dhal, Faculty School of Gender and Development Studies IGNOU, and today I will be talking about social construction of gender, which is part 2. And I hope you must have had the first lecture on social construction of gender under the course BGAC 001 Gender Sensitization, Society, Culture and Change. And I am sure in the previous lecture on social construction of gender, you must have had the discussion on how gender is a social category or how gender constructed in relation to masculinity and femininity. And today we are going to discuss precisely the interplay between power and gender and to what extent power constructs gender in the context of society. We are going to in this video we are going to focus on it. And the second part of this video will be precisely discussing on the two conceptual framework, that is the public and private debate, and how feminists have interrogated the notion of or the domain of public and private in the understanding of gender. We are going to focus on. And with this, let's start the discussion on the social construction of gender part 2. The learning outcomes. After watching this video, you will be able to comprehend why gender is a valid social category to understand social realities, which means that gender is a social unit or is a social category. And it, if you really look at your own circumstances, you could very well understand that women, men and other genders, they behave differently or their life situation is different. Therefore, we say gender is a social category. And the second learning outcomes would be, you would be analyze what are certain basic theoretical positions to discuss about gender as a socially constructed category. And within this theoretical construct, we are going to speak about biological essentialism and social constructionism and the public-private dichotomy, and how these theoretical positions help us to construct or to analyze gender in a much more critical manner. We are going to see. The last learning outcome would be critically reflect on the concept of public and private debates from feminist positions. So let's start the discussion about what is gender. Gender has been central to the feminist project to address the question of inequality between men, women and other genders, which was considered to be ordained by the nature. So the moment if you really look at the statement, question of inequality, the question of inequality reflects on the hierarchical relationship that women and men they share. And you may have come across certain terms such as gender dynamics, gender relations, gender roles, gender division of labor, gender stereotypes, and what these terms mean to us. It actually, these terms manifest a hierarchical relationship that exists between women and men, and this hierarchy is been created by the institution or the ideology of patriarchy and power, and precisely which makes gender as a social construct. Gender as a concept can be defined and used in multiple ways depending on the individuals how they are using it. The world in which we live is shaped by gender, yet gender is embodied, lived and experienced by women, men in specific way. So which means that the way we live in this world, this world is gendered in nature, or the society is gendered in nature. Therefore, in feminist term, we use the term embodied, or the lived experiences of women will be different from the lived experiences of men and other genders. And the term lived experience is actually a methodological term which has been used by feminist researcher to understand or to provide a critical lens to look at that nothing is normative in this society. everything is been gendered in nature or can be seen or can be discussed or analyzed from a gender perspective. Therefore, gender cannot be abstracted from social practices and relationship within which it is enmeshed. So, gender therefore, since it is so much embedded in the community relationship, in the society relationship, social institutions like family, caste, class, religion, ethnicity, so on and so forth. So, it is very much important for us to understand gender in relation to society and culture. According to Jackson and Scott, gender is thus a social structural phenomena which is produced, negotiated and sustained in everyday social interaction. The difference between biological sex and the social gender has been debated by various scholars over the decades of 20th century. This distinction between sex and gender has been discussed within the two polarized broader theoretical positions such as biological essentialism and social constructionism. So, there is a difference. I am sure the first lecture on social construction of gender must have been reflected on the dichotomy between sex and gender, that sex is biological in nature or character, gender is more social in nature, which means socialization process shapes the understanding or the relationship of gender. Why? Let us take a simple example of being a girl, right? Why a girl behaves like a girl or a woman behaves like a woman? It is a learned behavior. We are learning these behaviors through socialization process and within the social institutions like family, which is the primary social institution for any individuals to acquire certain learned behavior. Therefore, two positions, biological essentialism and social constructionism, they are the polarized position, they are the polar opposite to each other in the understanding, or they provide different approaches to understand the sex-gender dichotomy. The basic question is whether sex, the maleness or femaleness, causes the gender which is culturally constructed, notions of femininity and masculinity. So, which means the moment we utter the term sex, which reflects the maleness or the femaleness, the biological character of the individual, where gender is more in relation to your femininity and masculinity, that is the trait that you acquire or one person acquires as individual or as human. Two polarized positions described as biological essentialism and social constructionism debated on this question. What is biological essentialism? It argues that social roles and psychological attributes of females and males is a direct product of biological factors, which means biological factor is operative in nature and it has a direct connection with the social traits. These factors are still operative in its nature and character. On the other hand, social constructionism sees gender is socially constructed in nature. For example, traits or behavior of individuals are largely shaped by the socialization process, social norms and practices. This position helps us to see how our behavior is organized and created through social interactions. For example, if you really reflect on some of the behaviors in daily life, you could see that why a woman behaves like a woman, or for example, give the example of family and the role of mother and father, and you could see the role are being based on the gender division of labor that exists within each and every family. Therefore, this position, social construction is a very significant position, and this helps us to critically look at or study the behavior or attributes which is organized on the basis of gender relations or the power hierarchy that the men and women or other genders they share in the society. And it has been reflected, or it can be studied when we actually see any interaction, whether within a community or social life, family, or within institution of marriage, caste, class, so on and so forth. Gender along with other social institutions such as family, marriage, caste, class, religion, ethnicity, disability and sexuality. All the social institutions shape the social structure of the past and the present. And when the moment we talk about gender is socially constructed, I would like to give a very example of culture. So how there is an universal subordination of women, which has been very well argued by the feminist thinker, writer, academician Sherry Otner. And at the same time, culture plays a very important role in the construction of gender. Let's say various scholars like Leela Dubé, in her work on symbolization of biological reproduction, Leela Dubé is a social anthropologist, and her work shows how gender is shaped by culture or myths. Dubé states that how symbolization of biological reproduction is expressed through terms like seed and the earth, and it has been represented through social, through rituals and through different myths. Therefore, we say that the construction of gender also varies in relation to culture. Similarly, within one culture, the gender constructions also vary in relation to time, and therefore we really have to locate gender. Gender is a flexible and it's fluid in nature, and the variation we could see across cultures, within culture, but over or across times. And to reflect Dubé's work on symbolization of biological reproduction, which is expressed through terms like seed and the earth. Seed gives life to the child, which comes from the father's blood, and on the other hand, earth identifies with womb, which provides warmth and nourishment to the fetus and its growth. So, in the representation of seed and earth, you could see that how there is a dichotomy that exists between the nature, the mother earth vis-a-vis the culture, and it has been, mother earth has been symbolized with women in relation to her reproduction, and seed is been symbolized as culture in relation to man's creativity. And this dichotomy of seed and earth very well depicts the role of mother as a nurturer and caregiver within the private sphere or within the home, vis-a-vis the role of father as the breadwinner in the society. And this is, this example can help us to locate gender in relation to culture across societies, and it can actually help us to, in fact, you can take up small studies or to understand certain rituals, social practices or myths in different context or in different culture within India and outside of it, and which will provide us to understand gender in a more analytical term. Next concept which we are going to focus now in our succeeding slides is public and private dichotomy. What is its meaning? And I am sure you all must have been using the term public and private, but now we are going to look at this dichotomy or the distinction between public and private from a feminist lens, or from a feminist position. According to the liberal political thought, the concept of public and private spheres were conceptualized in connection with the relationship of individual with the state. So, why this public and private sphere comes into existence? It comes into existence because of the significant relationship what individual shares with the state. Initially, the operation of the state was limited to the activities of the public sphere. Thus, it excluded the abuse and problems committed in the sphere of the private. So, the moment you talk about public, always it has been conceptualized or theorized in relation to the state and therefore what happens within your home, within your family, or within the private sphere, with women, then it becomes it was never part of the state agenda. More so, the opposition and distinction between public and private was taken as natural, normative, trans-historical and trans-cultural within the liberal political thought. So, the distinction was quite accepted as normative distinction, as gendered distinction. I would like to use the term gendered distinction, or it has been accepted as a natural distinction between the public and private, where men will be more associated with the public, whereas private primarily represented by the women and their work and activities within the sphere of home. The public sphere encompasses the domains of business, economy, education, politics and the law, and the sphere of the private comprises of the domestic domain, that includes family, which have been considered as a site for women's oppression and subordination. So, if you really look at like family is been theorized as a primary institution for socialization, therefore the infant becomes a social being or transforms into a social being within the family. And it has been noticed that within the family, through social practices, you can see that how women's subordination is been shaped and ordained. Therefore, feminist intervention was more towards constituting, how family is been seen as a site for women's oppression and subordination. The distinction between public and private is more complex within feminist studies because it goes beyond the simple division of the two on the basis of its social activities, which takes place separately. So, it is not about the distinction is a simplistic division on the basis of gender division of labor, but it is more complex in nature, because why there is a certain work or activities, or what we call in feminist lens, sometimes we use the term reproductive labor, and what that is associated with women's work vis-a-vis the productive labor that is associated with men's work, and these activities are being organized or are being shaped on the basis of gender identities. So, as Patman argues, the division denies the symbiotic and dependency relationship which exists between the two spheres, and both spheres share a hierarchical relationship. Therefore, the division is not a simple division on the basis of gender identities, but the dichotomy between public and private, or these two spheres, they deny any symbiotic and dependency relationship. So, it is very difficult even to restructure the household activities on the basis of gender relations. But certainly we are seeing many changes, particularly if you really look at the COVID-19 pandemic, and you could see that how men are taking up responsibility of the household. So, therefore, you could actually see certain change within the sphere of household, but more need to be done when we are actually look at the spheres, and these two domains or spheres, they actually share a power relationship, and that is on the basis of hierarchy. Feminists have challenged this distinction between public and private as natural and universal to every society, broadly under two conceptual accounts, which include women's location within the private sphere leading to their systematic exclusion from public life. So, as I said, or as I discussed in the previous slide, that how women's reproductive labor, which constitute women as a mother, which constitute women as a homemaker and a caregiver to the children and the elder. So, the invisibility of women's labor within the household, so also the unpaid labor, which has been theorized by feminist economics across the world. These work reflect the systematic exclusion of women from the public life or their participation in the public life. And the emphasis is on the political nature of the private sphere, which includes family, marriage and kinship. So, the sphere of private is also political in nature, because why there is invisibility of reproductive role in the home. Similarly, or unpaid labor, or why there is a distinction between reproductive and the productive labor. So, this shows the private sphere is also political in nature, and therefore, you could see that within private sphere there is a power relationship or power dynamics which has been shared by both the genders, women and men, differently. Therefore, the division has denied the right to equality for women both within family and in the public domain. Earlier, if you could look at different laws, you could see that how women did not have access to or the ownership of the property. So much of change has come also within the public domain, because the state has intervened into the private sphere, and which we are going to discuss in this session towards the end. This dichotomy is also visible in all the spheres of life, starting from law, human rights, work and economy, science and in the state participation. This has severe implications for women's access to education, livelihood and justice. So, you could see that when women have been denied access to the public sphere, so it has a severe implication in terms of education, livelihood and justice. Not only in terms of education, even if you really look at the example of female infanticide or the practice of female feticide in India, you could see that a girl child does not have the right to be born. In fact, sociologists like Ravinder Kaur looked at these social practices and these this culture, and how she argued that the girl child in fact does not have the right to be born, therefore the community practices female feticide. So this this relationship between public and private, one could say that it's not a simplistic device, or it's not a simplistic division in itself. It is complex because it has been enmeshed within the community and society, and it has been shaped by the power relationship that exist within every institutions. Feminists thus have rejected such an absolute separation of the two spheres, that is the private has been separated from the public life, and so feminist scholars have actually rejected this absolute separation. There is no separation, but rather one can intervene to bring about gender justice in the society. For example, the gender division of labor has not only created the notion of unpaid female labor within the family and women's access to undervalued jobs in the labor market, even though it has contributed largely for the sustenance of the public sector. So, there is an extension. The unpaid female labor has been well accepted within the family, and therefore, when women come to the labor market, they have less bargaining power, and you could see the simple example of wage differentials. And if you go to any construction site or any factories, you could see that how women laborers are paid less compared to the male laborers. And because it has been seen that the activities associated with female, it is more feminized in nature, and therefore their labor is devalued or it has been less paid. Even they come out of the private sphere, but the manifestation of this invisibility of labor still exists in the public domain or within the labor market. The invisibility of women's reproductive work in the society is the manifestation of this gender division of labor. It can be argued that this division between the two domains is both dependent and political in nature. Public-private dichotomy and feminist account. So, how feminists have negotiated with this or interrogated the concept of public-private dichotomy. Within gender studies, the question of private-public dichotomy emerged due to the gendered nature of these spheres, association of masculinity with the public on the one hand and the association of femininity with the private on the other hand. Feminist writers have engaged with this debate in multiple ways. Some have given an anthropological account, while others have taken a historical account of the origin of public-private dichotomy. L. Davidoff explains this separation in the context of the 19th century England. Sherry Ortner sees association of women with domesticity as universal to society and culture. Sylvia Wallaby engages with private-public separation in her explanation of the concept of private patriarchy and her analysis of change in women's status in Britain. The feminist criticism of this dichotomy centers around questions such as where and why this dividing line is being drawn between these spheres and whether there is a need to draw this line and so on. Broadly, the demand for equal rights for women and men within family and the political domain has been an essential feature of feminist struggle. Feminist discussion on public and private dichotomy centers around two important debates such as nature-culture debate and personalist political debate. Towards the 1980s, when women in democratic nations had owned the right to citizenship and achieved the status of equal voting rights with men, the claim of gender inequality on the basis of public-private division came under question. The opposition between women's nature and men's culture became central to understanding the universal subordination of women across societies. Culture is defined as creative and associated with men's activities. Ortner sees this dichotomy of nature and culture as a consequence of the separation between the public and private spheres, and therefore these cannot be viewed as natural and given. Feminists have questioned the notion that women's subordination is a product of nature because nature of subordination and the meaning of the private and public change across societies. Hence, both women and nature are subordinated to oppressive culture. The second debate is personal is political. The personal is political was adopted as a slogan by feminists in their political struggle to challenge the ambiguities of the public-private divide. This slogan has drawn women's attention towards the social acceptance of dualism in the life of women and men. Feminists have emphasized that the personal is structured through public interventions such as laws on rape, abortion and inheritance, policies of child care, implementation of welfare benefit schemes and gender division of labor at home and the workplace. The provision of child care leave for women has given them the scope to balance work and parenting. However, it reproduces the idea that childbearing primarily rests with the women. Similarly, there are occupations such as nursing, teaching and secretarial work which carry gender stereotyping in the labor market. The inherent inequalities of the private can only be resolved through political agendas and action. Women's daily experiences has become a means to understand the interconnection between the private and public. Kate Millett, in her book Sexual Politics, defines power in terms of politics in the private realm. Within domestic sphere, power is exercised in forms of sexual politics or sexual domination. The exercise of power by the individual man upon the individual women within the household is political in nature, which Kate Millett described as personal becomes political. This debate of understanding private, personal as political can enable feminist scholars and activists to analyze issues concerning domestic violence, marital rape, female feticide, sex selective abortion, women's access and control over family resources and decision making, which exclusively form parts of the personal earlier. And how do we dismantle the divide between private and public? Education for women can enable them to use the office bearer's position meaningfully to articulate and represent larger women's concern before the local bodies. Education plays an important role in a woman's life to exercise her rights in public domain, like having access to paid labor, to choice and control over reproduction and so on. In the context of gender and governance, literate women possesses a greater capability to lead a panchayat and can represent the interest of family and society. The shift of women from participation in the movements to participation in institutional bodies has enabled them to formulate gender positive public policies. In the context of governance, women's movement and activism are seen as tools to dismantle the division between public and the private. An increasing representation of women in government bodies and other institutions is showing the dissolution of the boundaries between private and public. Let us sum up. Private and public spheres are no more viewed in opposition to each other in every circumstance and enlarging their frontiers to accommodate issues of concern. Biological essentialism and social constructionism are two significant positions to analyze the social reality on the axis of gender. Gender is not given or a fixed category, but it changes across cultures, and within a culture in a given point of time. So with this, I hope you would have enjoyed watching this video and listening to the session. More session will come up for the course Gender Sensitization, Society, Culture and Change. Thank you.